In April 2018, police arrested a 72-year-old former police officer in Sacramento, California, and charged him with a string of murders and rapes committed across the state more than 3 decades earlier. He had never been arrested for any of it. His DNA had never been entered into any criminal database. He had spent 40 years believing, correctly by every conventional measure, that no fingerprint, no witness, and no piece of physical evidence could ever connect him to what he had done. He was wrong about exactly one thing. Somewhere out there, a distant relative of his, someone he may never have even met and almost certainly never thought about, had once spit into a plastic tube out of simple curiosity about their own family tree, wanting to know where their ancestors came from. That single decision, made by someone else entirely, for a completely unrelated and entirely innocent reason years earlier, became the thread that finally unraveled everything. This is the story of how a hobby used by millions of ordinary people to find their own ancestors became one of the most powerful crime-solving tools in modern law enforcement history, and how it is now, right now, still identifying killers and returning names to victims who waited decades, in one case more than 40 years, to finally be found. Stay with me. Subscribe right now before we start. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. First, understand the basic science, because it is genuinely different from anything you have likely seen dramatized on a television crime show. Traditional DNA matching works like a direct fingerprint comparison, checking a crime scene sample against a specific individual's profile already sitting inside a criminal database, built from people previously arrested or convicted. If the suspect was never arrested before, was never entered into that database in the first place, this method finds nothing at all, no matter how good the DNA sample recovered from the scene actually is. Genetic genealogy works completely differently, and this is the part that surprises most people. Investigators take DNA recovered from a crime scene, sometimes decades old and badly degraded, and instead of searching for an exact one-to-one match, they search for family resemblance instead, the same kind of distant genetic overlap that quietly connects third and fourth cousins who have never met and likely never will. Because your DNA is roughly 50% identical to each of your parents, and roughly 25% identical to each of your grandparents. That overlap becomes fainter and fainter with every additional generation, but it never fully disappears entirely. Even a fourth cousin, someone connected to you only through a shared great-great-great-grandparent from more than a century ago, will typically still share a small but genuinely detectable amount of DNA with you. If enough people upload their own genetic data to public genealogy websites for entirely ordinary reasons, curiosity about where their family came from, nothing whatsoever to do with crime, then a large enough public database becomes, almost by accident, a tool capable of identifying nearly anyone whose distant relatives happen to participate, regardless of whether that specific person ever took a test themselves. Second, the case that started everything, and it did not begin in California the way most people assume. In 1985, the remains of a woman and a young girl were discovered inside a 55-gallon steel drum in Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, found by a hunter who had no idea what he had stumbled onto. 15 years later, in 2000, a second drum was discovered just 300 feet away, containing the remains of 2 more girls, confirming what investigators had long suspected but could never prove. Investigators knew instinctively that all 4 had been murdered by the same person, but for years, they had no name for the killer, and no names at all for his 4 victims, an almost unheard-of double mystery in American criminal investigation. The man responsible had spent decades living under a rotating series of false identities, including one called Bob Evans, another called Curtis Kimball, and yet another called Larry Vanner, and was only definitively identified in 2017, 7 years after his actual death in prison, where he had been serving time under yet another alias entirely for a completely different, unrelated murder. His true identity turned out to be Terry Peter Rasmussen, a man investigators eventually connected to at least 5 confirmed homicides across multiple states, using several entirely different names throughout a decades-long life of evasion. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, working from severely degraded DNA extracted from hair samples since the remains had been exposed to the New Hampshire elements for years, used the same reverse family tree building process to finally identify him with certainty. It was the very first time this specific technique had ever been used to identify a criminal suspect in the history of American law enforcement, years before most people had ever heard the term genetic genealogy at all, let alone understood what it meant. Third, naming the killer was only the beginning of this particular story, not the end most people would assume. Even after Rasmussen was identified in 2017, the identities of his 4 young victims remained completely unknown for 2 more full years. An almost unheard of gap in any American murder investigation, where the perpetrator is named before a single victim is. The breakthrough came from a genuinely unexpected direction entirely, outside any official investigation. A researcher and librarian named Rebecca Heath searching internet forums in her own personal time out of pure fascination with the case, stumbled across an old post from 1999 in which a man was searching for his long-lost half-sister, a woman named Sarah McWatters he had never actually met. Heath connected the pieces herself, realizing this missing woman's family story matched specific details of the Bear Brook case that had been publicly reported, and submitted the tip directly to investigators in October 2018. Working in parallel and entirely independently, Barbara Rae Venter continued applying genetic genealogy directly to the victim's own severely degraded DNA, extracted painstakingly from bone and hair samples. Together, their combined efforts, one built on careful internet sleuthing and one built on laboratory science, confirmed the identities of 3 of the 4 victims in 2019, Marlis Honeychurch and her 2 daughters, Marie Vaughn and Sarah McWatters, finally giving 3 murdered people their names back after more than 3 decades spent as unidentified remains known to investigators only by a case file number. Fourth, the very last piece of this exact case was only solved in September of 2025, less than a year ago as of this video, meaning this story is not history you are hearing secondhand years later, but genuinely recent news. The 4th victim, a young girl investigators had referred to for decades simply as the middle child, remained unidentified, even after her 3 fellow victims had finally been named in 2019. In early 2024, the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit partnered with a nonprofit organization called the DNA Doe Project to re-examine her case one more time, using updated, improved genetic genealogy techniques that had continued advancing in the years since. Through extensive DNA analysis and careful genealogical research, she was finally confirmed as Rhea Rasmussen, the killer's own biological daughter, born in 1976 in Orange County, California, a detail that added a genuinely devastating new layer to an already horrifying case. Her identification, announced by the New Hampshire Attorney General's office, closed a search that had spanned more than 40 years and finally gave every one of the 4 Bear Brook victims their name back, a milestone officials specifically described as bringing a measure of closure that had eluded the case for a full generation. Investigators continue actively searching for what happened to Rhea's mother, a woman named Pepper Reed, who has not been seen since the late 1970s and is believed by authorities to be one more of Rasmussen's uncounted, still unresolved victims. Subscribe right now because the next part of this video covers exactly how investigators went from a random stranger's spit sample to identifying a specific named suspect out of millions of possible people, and the surprising ongoing debate over whether this entire technique should even be allowed to exist. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Fifth, back to where this story actually started for most of the public, the case that made genetic genealogy a household term almost overnight. For over 4 decades, a man known publicly only as the Golden State Killer had evaded identification despite committing at least 12 murders and roughly 50 sexual assaults across California between 1974 and 1986, a crime spree so extensive and so terrifying that it shaped an entire region's sense of safety for years. His DNA sat in evidence storage for decades, definitively unique, definitively his, and definitively useless against any existing criminal database, since he had simply never been caught, arrested, or processed before, meaning his genetic profile had no counterpart anywhere in the system to match against. In 2018, investigator Paul Holes took an unconventional approach that no one had successfully tried before at this scale. He uploaded the crime scene DNA profile to GEDmatch, a free public website built specifically for ordinary genealogy hobbyists to find their own distant relatives, not designed for or intended for law enforcement use at all. The search returned distant genetic matches, people who were the killer's 3rd and 4th cousins without having the slightest idea, individuals who had uploaded their own DNA years earlier for entirely personal reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with any crime, let alone this one. From there, genetic genealogist Barbara Rae Venter, the same researcher who would later crack the Bear Brook case using similar methods, began what she calls reverse genealogy, painstakingly building an enormous family tree working backward from those distant cousin matches, connecting branch after branch using traditional genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage records, newspaper obituaries, and public records, until the branches finally converged on a specific individual who matched the killer's age, general location, and background profile. That individual was Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights. Investigators watched him for weeks, collected a discarded item bearing his own DNA, and confirmed the match in a matter of hours. DeAngelo was arrested in April 2018 and later pleaded guilty to 13 murders and numerous additional charges, closing one of the most notorious unsolved crime sprees in American history using a public family history website he almost certainly never knew existed, let alone imagined would ever be turned against him. Sixth, understand exactly why this method works so well against exactly the kind of criminal who successfully evades every other conventional investigative technique available to police. A person can absolutely refuse to ever submit their own DNA to a testing company, and many people who commit serious crimes are, understandably, exactly the kind of people who would make that choice deliberately. What they cannot control is whether their third cousin, someone they may not even know exists, has ever met, or would recognize on the street, decides to explore their own family history for entirely unrelated personal reasons, completely unconnected to any crime. Researchers studying the underlying mathematics of these public genetic databases have found that once a database reaches roughly 2% of a given population, it becomes statistically likely that virtually any individual within that broader population can be identified through at least a third cousin match somewhere in the system, whether that specific person ever personally participated in DNA testing or not. This single statistical fact is precisely why the technique has now been used to help resolve several hundred violent crimes and previously unidentified remains cases, since the Golden State Killer arrest first proved the method could genuinely work at scale, including cases that had gone cold for 20 years, 30 years, and in the case of Bear Brook, well over 40 years before finally being resolved. Seventh, this power has created real, ongoing controversy that genealogists and privacy advocates themselves are still actively debating, with no clear consensus in sight. When GEDmatch's role in the Golden State Killer case became public knowledge, the site's own operators stated clearly they had not been approached or formally consulted by investigators beforehand, and had simply never anticipated that their small hobbyist platform would be used this way by anyone. The site subsequently changed its policies to require users to explicitly opt in before their data could be searched by law enforcement at all, a decision that dramatically reduced the size of the searchable database overnight and frustrated investigators working other pending cases who had come to rely on the previous, more open system. Legal advocates have raised a specific concern worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. People who submit their own DNA purely for ancestry research are, often completely unknowingly, also making their entire extended family, including relatives who never personally agreed to anything or even know a test was taken, searchable by police in a way that convicted offenders sitting in regulated government databases simply are not, since those offenders at least went through a formal legal process that established the terms of their inclusion. It remains one of the more genuinely unresolved ethical questions in modern forensic science, a single technique simultaneously responsible for delivering some of the most meaningful, tearful resolutions imaginable to grieving families who had waited decades for answers, and for opening a genuinely new category of genetic privacy question that simply did not meaningfully exist for anyone before 2018. Two cases, and one technique that connects them across opposite ends of the country. A killer who evaded identification for 4 full decades, finally named because a stranger, several branches removed on his own family tree, once decided out of pure curiosity to look into their own ancestry, never imagining where that decision would eventually lead. 4 young victims in New Hampshire, waiting decades for their own names to be returned to them, the very last one confirmed just last year, in 2025, closing a case that had haunted an entire state since 1985. A technique invented almost by accident using a free hobbyist website never designed or intended for anything like this, and a genuinely unresolved debate about genetic privacy that grows more urgent, not less. With every single new case, this method helps to close. If you have ever taken a DNA test for your own family history research, understand that your decision may extend further than your own personal curiosity ever intended, connecting you to relatives you have never met and never will meet, in ways that are now, provably and repeatedly, capable of resolving some of the coldest, most painful unsolved cases in the entire country. The DNA Doe Project, the nonprofit organization behind the final Bear Brook identification, continues actively working right now to identify hundreds of additional unidentified deceased individuals across the country using these exact same techniques, case by case, name by name. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continue partnering with law enforcement agencies nationwide to bring names back to people who have waited decades, sometimes their entire lives, to finally be found and returned to the families who never stopped looking for them. Subscribe right now if this video showed you a side of genealogy you had never considered before, one where a hobby and a homicide investigation turn out to run on exactly the same underlying science. Every week on this channel, we go this deep into the real science and the real history behind the records and the DNA that connect us to people we have never met and sometimes never even knew existed. Subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment below. Had you heard of the Bear Brook case before this video, or the Golden State Killer's connection to a genealogy website built for hobbyists? Do you think the privacy trade-off is worth what these specific cases have accomplished for the families involved? Tell me what you think in the comments, honestly. Since this is a topic reasonable people genuinely disagree about, this is where the real conversations happen on this channel. Share this with anyone who has ever taken a DNA test out of simple curiosity about their own family, because the reach of that one small decision may extend much further than they ever realized at the time.